Ukraine has permission to strike Russian targets inside Russian territory, meaning the world may be inching ever closer to World War III. At least, that's the impression that David Cameron, the UK's Foreign Secretary, gave with recent comments that appeared to give the green light to Ukraine. The Kremlin didn't react well. It believes that using Western weapons to strike targets inside Russia is an escalation of the war it started, and with that escalation, potential repercussions that could see Britain, along with several other NATO-aligned countries, dragged directly into the conflict. The question now is simple: what happens next? Will Ukraine actually start striking Russian targets inside Russia itself? Has it started doing so already, and if so, are Russia's claims of an escalation justified? Before we answer those questions, let's examine the comments that have led us to this situation. On May 3, 2024, David Cameron pledged to provide Ukraine with £3 billion of military aid, approximately $3.84 billion, per year, as long as it takes for that aid to help Ukraine win the war against Russia. That alone would have come as a blow to the Kremlin. Not only would Ukraine receive more help from the UK, which hasn't been shy about supporting the country since the beginning of the war, but the comments represent a long-term commitment. That $3.84 billion will come every year, with no political wrangling required to get it approved. But these weren't the comments that so infuriated the Kremlin. In addition to pledging the money, Cameron also said, "Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself." A somewhat ambiguous statement. Failing to look at the subtext here could even lead somebody to believe that Cameron is simply restating that Ukraine has the right to defend itself on its own territory, but that's not what he's saying. Prior to making this statement, the UK has generally made it clear that any of the weapons it provides should only be used on Ukrainian sovereign territory. That includes the Storm Shadow missile, which can travel for around 248 miles. Ukraine has used that missile to conduct several strikes in Russian-controlled Crimea, which fits the UK's description of sovereign territory. That much was made clear in February 2024, when the country's government released a statement on the 10th anniversary of Crimea's annexation. "We want to be clear that the UK will never recognize Russia's illegal claims to the region or to any Ukrainian territory, and that we will continue to do all we can to stop Putin's war machine and support Ukraine in their fight for as long as it takes." So Ukraine already had the green light to use British missiles in Crimea, but now it appears to have the green light to use them in Russia itself. Pay special attention to the "just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine" portion of Cameron's comments. They suggest that Britain is fine with Ukraine taking an eye for an eye approach with Russia. Just as Russia strikes in Ukraine, so can Ukraine strike in Russia. Cameron even made that aspect clear later when he said that Ukraine absolutely has the right to strike back at Russia. Britain isn't the only country that has permitted Ukraine to use the weapons it supplies on Russian territory. Politico reports that most countries providing aid to Ukraine since the war began have done so under the condition that Ukraine doesn't use any of the weapons they supply to attack Russia itself. That's changing. Both Latvia and Finland, countries that likely see themselves as potential targets for Russia if it succeeds in taking Ukraine, have since made similar comments to Cameron's. Ukraine has the right to use any weapons they supply to defend itself, which includes direct strikes inside Russia. Moscow's response was outraged. Dmitry Peskov, a spokesman for the Kremlin, called Cameron's comments another very dangerous statement, before going on to claim that they represented a direct escalation of the tension around the Ukrainian conflict. Chillingly, he added that such comments could pose a larger threat to European security if they weren't backpedaled. Cameron has taken nothing back. If anything, his comments appear to have emboldened others. On May 24, 2024, NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg took part in an interview with The Economist. Stoltenberg, who is coming to the end of his 10-year stint in the role, used the interview to claim that the time has come for Ukraine's allies to consider whether they should lift some of the restrictions they've placed on how Ukraine uses the weapons they supply. Some already have, as we've seen with Britain, Latvia, and Finland. However, The Economist believes that Stoltenberg's comments may have been targeted toward the United States. It says his claims had a clear, if unnamed, target, with the US lifting its own restrictions potentially being a key factor in Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia. It gets worse for Vladimir Putin. A Sky News report from May 28th looked at the comments made by Poland's Foreign Minister, Radoslaw Sikorski, who believes that the country shouldn't rule out sending its troops into Ukraine. Those comments echo French President Emmanuel Macron's words in February. "We shouldn't rule it out. We should leave Putin guessing as to our intentions." Putin is watching his war with Ukraine slowly shift. In the past, he's been able to launch operations in Ukraine with no direct threat being posed to Russia. Even though he understood that Ukraine was receiving weapons from overseas, and those weapons were being used to kill Russian troops inside Ukraine, he knew that Russia itself was safe. Ukraine could only use those weapons to defend itself on its own territory. Now he's not so certain. He has several countries, France and Poland included, claiming that direct intervention inside Ukraine is a possibility. And with Britain, France, and Latvia all approving the use of their weapons in Russia, as well as NATO's Secretary General placing pressure on the United States, it may only be a matter of time before Ukraine starts to target military installations in Russia itself. Putin's response shows just how much these recent developments concern him. Outside of using a Kremlin spokesperson to talk about how Britain's green light represents an unnecessary escalation of tensions within Europe, he has also directly threatened the United Kingdom. On May 6th, Reuters reported that Russia summoned the country's British ambassador, Nigel Casey, to its foreign ministry to lodge a formal complaint against Cameron's comments. For its part, Britain denied that Casey was summoned, instead saying he'd arrived for a diplomatic and pre-arranged meeting in which he would reinforce the UK's support for Ukraine. Russia still decided to use that meeting to make threats. The Foreign Ministry supposedly warned Casey that the use of any British weapons on Russian territory, even by Ukraine, would make Britain a de facto part of the conflict, and with that role comes the possibility that British military facilities, both in Ukraine and elsewhere, could be targeted. In case there was any doubt left, the Foreign Ministry went on to say the ambassador was called upon to reflect on the inevitable catastrophic consequences of such hostile steps by London and immediately refute the belligerent provocative statements of the head of the Foreign Office in the most decisive and unambiguous way. It's unlikely that Russia got what it wanted out of Casey. But it had delivered its message: allow Ukraine to use your weapons in Russia, and Russia will respond. If the threat wasn't clear enough from the Foreign Ministry's statement, it was made crystal clear when Putin ordered his military to hold battlefield nuclear weapons drills. That exercise began on May 21st, with Reuters reporting that Russian vehicles had started to gather in Russia's southern military district for the first phase of the drill. The district lies adjacent to Ukraine, with Russia apparently running exercises for the launch of tactical nuclear warheads. To make its point even clearer, Moscow has also involved Belarus in the drills, which is a Russian ally and a country that shares a border with Ukraine. Russia's foreign ministry even provided details about the drills Moscow ran. It said Russian troops were practicing obtaining what it calls special ammunition, essentially code for nuclear warheads, for Russia's Iskander missiles. They were also practicing equipping potential launch vehicles with those missiles, as well as covertly moving them to designated launch positions, presumably so they could be used to strike Ukraine. Aviation units also took part in the drill, with crews practicing how to fit nuclear warheads to Kinzhal hypersonic missiles before they fly into designated patrol areas. Again, a term that seemed like code for potential launching points. These weren't pre-planned drills. Russia's foreign ministry made that clear when it claimed that they should send a sobering signal to the West, specifically the United Kingdom, as well as what it sees as the puppets that the West controls in Ukraine. It added, "We hope these drills will cool the hotheads in Western capitals, while helping the countries that have provided the green light to Ukraine to realize the potential catastrophic consequences of the strategic risks they're generating." There's the word again, catastrophic. As devastating to Putin as Ukraine getting the okay to use British weapons on Russian soil may be, he's using it as an opportunity to showcase Moscow's power. These drills are a stark reminder to the UK, as well as Ukraine, that Russia has tactical nuclear warheads. They're also a reminder that its troops know how to launch those warheads and that Russia is a far stronger nuclear power than Britain. You could also consider the drills a veiled warning to the United States. Don't bow to NATO pressure, Putin may be telling the US. If you do, we may be forced to turn the Ukraine war into a nuclear conflict that will involve the US if you grant permission to use your weapons on Russian territory. The thing is, you could argue that Ukraine is already using Western weapons to strike Russia on Russian territory. Take Ukraine's attacks on Russian oil refineries as an example. Global Witness points out those attacks started in 2024, essentially allowing Ukraine to create a new front in the war. But it's also here where Ukraine starts to see pushback from its military allies. Though Ukraine considers those refineries to be legitimate military targets, not least because they're believed to supply Russia's military with fuel, the United States has urged Ukraine to halt the attacks. Not because the US is worried about the attacks angering Russia. Rather, the US doesn't want Russian oil refineries going offline to affect global oil prices. Global Witness claims that President Joe Biden is so set on keeping US oil prices stable during the November 2024 election campaign that he wants Ukraine to hold off on these attacks until after that campaign ends. America's Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin outlined this thought process in April 2024, claiming that any Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil refineries would have a knock-on effect in terms of the global energy situation. His recommendation was that Ukraine focus attacks on tactical and operational targets, with Ukraine likely believing that those refineries fall into both categories, seeing as they're thought to be supplying Russian troops with fuel. Those attacks have also been effective. Ukraine struck 2 facilities during the first few months of 2024, Lukoil's Volgograd and Norsy factories. The latter is especially important. It provides about 11% of Russia's gasoline requirements, with Ukraine's drone strikes dropping its output by half. Attacks on the Volgograd factory resulted in fires breaking out, allowing Ukraine to claim a small victory against the largest petroleum products creating factory in Russia's southern border region. Worse yet for the US argument, court documents obtained by Global Witness show that both factories have signed contracts to supply the Russian military. Volgograd has a contract with Russia's Ministry of Defense dating back to 2018 to supply Moscow's military with oil products. The Norsy factory has a similar contract, in addition to one signed in 2020 that sees it providing jet fuel to the Federal Security Service. These are far from the only Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries within Russia. It's launched 12 in 2024 alone, flying in the face of America's politicized argument about avoiding such attacks because of their impact on oil prices. Still, the US response showcases how some Western nations have approached the concept of Ukraine attacking Russia on its own soil. Other attacks against Russia using Western weaponry are a little more complicated. For instance, does it count as an attack on Russian soil if Ukraine is attacking targets on the Russian side of the front line it shares with its enemy? Putin may think so. He regards all of Ukraine as Russian territory. Plus, his current desire for a ceasefire is on the condition that Russia essentially claims all of the territory it's captured from Ukraine thus far during the war. Following that logic, Ukraine's May 2024 attack on a Russian base in Luhansk could be considered a strike using Western weapons in Russian territory. The Sun reports that aerial images show Ukraine unleashing MGM-140 ATACMS missiles on Russian troops in a captured region of Luhansk. These missiles are devastating. Capable of reaching a top speed of 2,300 miles per hour, they have a range of around 186 miles and can carry a 500-pound warhead. But most notably, the missile essentially releases small bomblets upon detonating, allowing Ukraine to carpet a large area with explosions rather than unleashing a precise missile strike. Ukraine used that feature to its advantage in the Luhansk strike. Aerial footage analyzed by the Institute for the Study of War seems to show that the strikes targeted a Russian training ground, killing 116 troops. Another strike destroyed a launcher and charger in Russian-controlled territory, which Ukraine attacked with 6 of these missiles. There are also Ukraine's attacks on Sevastopol to consider. One of the most recent, a missile strike that struck 2 Russian landing ships and damaged infrastructure at the port in March 2024, demonstrates the level of attack Ukraine is willing to levy at Sevastopol. And again, we may see a territorial wrinkle at play here. Sevastopol is located in Crimea, which Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014. To Putin, that means it's Russian territory, and any attack using Western weapons could constitute an attack on Russia itself. But to Ukraine, Sevastopol and the entire Crimea belong to Kyiv, with any attacks launched there simply being attempts to retake territory that it believes rightfully belongs to it. The point here is that it's easy to argue that Ukraine is already striking within Russian territory. That's certainly what it's doing with the oil refineries, though it's not confirmed if it's used Western weapons to make those strikes. It absolutely used American missiles in its attacks in Luhansk, if that strike was conducted on territory that Russia had taken during the war. The same goes for the attacks in Sevastopol. Russia claims ownership of the Crimea region, so Ukraine's strikes against Russia's navy there and in the Black Sea could be considered attacks in Russia. Yet Russia has only now started to warn of catastrophic consequences. Is that a response to the UK and other countries giving their tacit approval for Ukraine to attack Russia more directly? Or are the threats another case of Russian bluster that Putin is unlikely to follow through with? That question remains to be answered in the coming months. What can't be argued is that Russia's outrage at what it deems an escalation of the Ukraine war smacks of hypocrisy. Obviously, Russia started the war, meaning it's directly responsible for the escalation of tensions both with Ukraine and Europe at large. But that's not where the hypocrisy ends. Russia has also been more than willing to use weapons supplied by other countries on Ukrainian territory. Take its receipt of hundreds of Iranian-made drones in mid-2023 as an example. A Reuters report from June of that year says the US believes Russia has deepened its military cooperation with Iran by purchasing several hundred one-way attack drones to use in Ukraine. White House spokesperson John Kirby released a statement claiming that Russia has been using Iranian UAVs to strike Kyiv and terrorize the Ukrainian population. He concluded by pointing out that Russia and Iran's military partnership is deepening. The interesting twist here is that Iran acknowledges that it sent drones to Russia. However, it claims that any drones sent arrived in Moscow before the Ukraine war began. Russia also says that it hasn't used any Iranian drones during the conflict. And yet the US says both are lying. It claims Iranian drones have been flowing into Russia since at least August 2022, and the two countries are cooperating so deeply that Russia is building a special plant in its Alabuga Special Economic Zone to build more of the drones. This is all being done despite Western sanctions that are supposed to prevent Iran from supplying Russia. Russia using Iranian drones throws David Cameron's comments into a new light. Given Britain's close military ties with the United States, as well as the fact that these claims are publicly available, he likely knows that Iran is supplying Russia with weapons. He also knows those weapons are being used in Ukraine. That leads to the obvious argument: what's good for the goose is good for the gander. In other words, if Russia is attacking Ukraine with weapons it has sourced from international partners, there's no reason why Ukraine shouldn't be able to do the same. And Iran isn't the only country that's providing Russia with weapons. In February 2024, Al Jazeera reported that Russia and North Korea appear to have worked out a trade agreement. In return for food, North Korea has sent artillery shells, a staggering 3 million of them since September 2023. The report quotes South Korea's defense minister, Shin Won-sik, who says his country's intelligence teams have tracked the transfer of around 6,700 containers believed to collectively carry either millions of 152mm artillery shells or around 500,000 122mm rounds. Talking to the Yonhap news outlet, he says, "It could possibly be a mix of the two, and you can say that at least several million shells have been sent." In return, Russia has not only been sending food to North Korea, but has also provided it with raw materials it can use when building other weapons. But just as it did with the reports of buying Iranian drones, Russia denies that it's receiving artillery shells from North Korea. Ukraine disputes that. A May 2024 BBC report suggests that Ukraine's military believes that not only is North Korea supplying Russia with artillery shells, but it's also delivering missiles. And those missiles have been fired in the dozens, injuring more than 70 people and killing at least 24. Russian hypocrisy rears its head again, and the list goes on. In April 2023, Reuters reported on Ukrainian claims that the country's military is increasingly finding Chinese components in weapons Russia is using in the country. Speaking in a video call, Vladislav Vlasiuk, who is an advisor for Ukraine's chief of staff, said, "The trend is now that there are less Western-made components but more, not hard to guess which country, made components. Of course, China." Such components were found in Orlan aerial drones, apparently used to replace the Swiss-made navigation systems those drones use, as well as in the fire control systems used in Russian tanks. The situation with China is a little different from that with Iran and North Korea. China has consistently denied providing weapons to Russia, a claim that appears to be backed by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Speaking to the BBC in April 2024, he said, "What's not happening is the provision of actual arms by China to Russia for use in Ukraine. Instead, China has been much more subtle," Blinken says, by providing critical components Russia can use to build up its war machine. He added that around 90% of the microelectronics Russia imports and likely uses in the war come from China, as do 70% of the machine tools used in its factories, just as Ukraine claimed in 2023. The threat of sanctions placed against China is designed to slow down this trade. But the point, as is the case with Iran and North Korea, remains: Russia is getting help from overseas powers to attack Ukraine. In essence, Russia already appears to be doing precisely what it's telling Ukraine it can't do, using weapons supplied by other countries to attack another country's territory. For Ukraine, this simply means that using its Western-made weapons to strike Russia would be leveling the playing field, all of which brings us to a final question. Now that Ukraine essentially has permission to use British weapons in Russia, will it actually do so? The odds are high that it will. After all, Zelensky has renewed his calls for Ukraine's Western allies to allow the use of their weapons in Russia, most recently during a joint press conference he held with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez on May 27th. "We need to intensify our joint work with our partners to achieve more. Security and tangible coercion of Russia to peace by all means," he said before adding, "Even those partners who are afraid to give this or that advice should understand that air defense is defense, not attack." In other words, Ukraine wants to use the F-16s and missiles it's receiving from its Western partners to retaliate against the 3,000 Russian aerial bombs flying into Ukraine from Russian territory. Jens Stoltenberg also renewed his calls for Ukraine's NATO allies to allow the use of their weapons on Russian territory. He reinforced what Zelensky said, pointing out that Russian forces are attacking from their own territory behind the front line. Much of that front line, he says, essentially runs along the border between Ukraine and Russia. If you cannot attack Russian forces on the other side of the front line because they are on the other side of the border, then of course, you really reduce the ability of the Ukrainian forces to defend themselves. That comment may offer some insight into the nature of the strikes Ukraine wants to use on Russia. It's not looking to fire missiles at Moscow. Instead, Ukraine simply wants the opportunity to attack Russian positions supporting troops on the front line, even if those positions are within Russian territory. The UK has granted permission for it to do so. Will the United States follow? Let us know what you think, and tell us what impact Ukraine having permission to launch attacks within Russian territory, at least from a handful of its partners, will have on the war. We look forward to checking out your comments, and thank you for watching the video.